Good morning, boys and girls. Today's Wednesday, and if you listen carefully while I read, it's kind of windy out today, and I'm sitting out on the patio so I can enjoy the fresh air, but the wind chimes are blowing in the breeze, so you'll be able to hear wind chimes. They sound like bells. Well, Poppy finally made it to Ragweed's family, and she shared with them the horrible news. And Rye was a little bit disappointed, and so he left. Erith is a little bit upset because she's not Poppy's best friend, and so all the people in Poppy's life are a little bit unhappy with her right now. We're going to start chapter 11 today. Mr. Canad makes some plans. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good, does it? It was still raining. In the middle of the pond, Mr. Canad used his webbed feet to propel himself swiftly across the water with strong, steady strokes. There was something mighty fine about swimming, enough to make one fit as a fiddle. Now and again he lifted his head and let the pattering rain soak him even more. "Bless my teeth and smooth my tail," he murmured. "I do love water." Then he thought how hard as to best express his feelings in words that had a real impact. Though it took some hard thinking, he worked it out. The whole thing is, he decided, it never rains, but it should do it a lot. When Mr. Canad said the phrase out loud, biting off the last T with his large orange teeth, he enjoyed it so much he repeated it to himself. It never rains, but it should do it a lot. A lot. I must use that, he told himself. Perhaps during the next company meeting. They would appreciate it. They would. With his strong paws, Mr. Canad pulled himself onto the bank, gave himself a shake, sending water in all directions, then turned to survey what had been achieved by the beaver's work. The little valley through which the brook had flowed there had been, in Mr. Canad's mind, a dull, dreary landscape, with little to behold but a piddling stream without power or grandeur. It had no depth. Its banks were wasteful in their simple, slopping nature. Why, the water itself had no texture or color. One could see through it. Limpid lily pads and useless bulrushes had marred its lazy surface. The animals who had wasted their time on the banks, mice, voles, otters, and toads, were insignificant. As far as Mr. Canad was concerned, it had been a place where nothing important ever had or would happen. An utter waste. But now, how different the beavers had made it. Every day the pond was growing wider, deeper, grander. It had taken on the vibrant color of mud. It was a home for hardy, busy beavers who worked day and night. This, Mr. Canad said to himself with genuine pride, is progress. And here he is looking at the bare hill where they've taken down all the trees and the pond as it gets deeper and fills up more and more. Funny how two different groups look at the same area in two completely different ways. The portly beaver felt so good about it, he spelled the word out letter by letter. Progress. Progress. And yet, Mr. Canad had to confess he was not fully satisfied. No, he was not. What he and his company had created was, he had to admit it, merely a pond. Mind, he told himself, there was nothing wrong with a pond. A beaver who built a good pond had every reason to be pleased with himself. Yet even the word pond suggested smallness, a compactness of size, which might be good enough for some, but not for the likes of Castor P. Canad and Company. Not only could they do better, they should do better. As Mr. Canad saw things, it was not a pond that was needed, but a lake. The beaver cast his keen engineer's eyes over the little valley. To achieve a lake, they needed to build another dam higher up. As he surveyed the little valley, he noticed a boulder perched on a hill, a large boulder. It was embedded in an outcropping of earth and stone. Flowers and shrubs shredded it. Mr. Canad perceived it. The boulder was doing nothing but sitting there. But it could be providing the perfect anchor for a new dam. An immense dam. With a dam at that spot, a large lake could be achieved. It would be his crowning creation, a monument to himself indeed. What could be better than Lake Canad? Mr. Canad liked the sound of it so much he said it a few times. Then he reminded himself, with some gleeful rubbing of back feet, that it was time to stop dreaming, time to get down to the nitty-gritty, to grasp the nettle, to get into the trenches, to show the flag, to hit the road running. But even as he watched and planned, he saw a mouse creep out from under the boulder and rush away. Mr. Canad knew what that meant. Mice were living under the boulder. As far as he knew, these mice were the only ones left around the brook. Most of the other creatures had departed. How pleasing to know there had been no resistance. Surely these last mice would quickly see the hopelessness of resisting the future. But what if they did not? He could swat them away, mere nothings that they were. Squashing the mice would be easy, though the thought made Mr. Canad uncomfortable. He was no bully, he just wanted progress. He wanted the world to appreciate him for the good he was doing. What he needed to do was find a way to convince the mice to leave of their own accord. It would make him feel good. Nothing was more important than to make good their slogan, progress without pain. Mr. Canad dove back into the pond and made his way to the main lodge. When he came within 5 feet of it, he dove and swam underwater until he found the entrance. Mr. Canad went to his plans, laid out on bark, and began to draw in detail. The boulder here, the large new dam there, the lake everywhere. Then he mused, if I can make a lake, well, bless my teeth and smooth my tail, why not an ocean? The thought made Mr. Canad grin broadly. Then he said, it never rains, but it should do it a lot on me. Then he gave himself over to finding a way to convince those last few mice that they should move away. Well, good luck with that, Mr. Canad. What do you think? Is he going to be able to convince them? I don't know. I don't think so. We'll have to wait and see. Chapter 12, In the Nest. In Clover and Valerian's nest, under the boulder, there was nothing but despair. Poppy's news of Ragweed's death had devastated the family. The coming of the beavers, the damming of the brook, the creation of the pond, their change of homes, all of that had been difficult to accept. But the family had shared the notion, spoken and unspoken, that Ragweed would return and somehow, some way, sort things out. Poppy's tragic news made it perfectly clear that no such thing would happen. Everything was now worse. In one corner of the nest sat a disconsolate Clover, staring off into nothing that anyone else could see. From time to time, she let forth a profoundly deep sigh and shifted her bulk, as if gathering her last breath in her chest. Oh, my eye keeps itching. Though her black eyes were dry, they held such a weight of wretched pain. It alarmed her own children. When a child brushed by, it always seemed like an accident, but it happened often. Clover reached out and touched it gently. Sometimes she stroked it, but there was little life or spirit to her paw. As for Valerian, though he was just as heartbroken as Clover, he spent his time and energy trying to comfort the children. Your mother will be fine, he kept telling them. She's just very sad. And it is sad. The children did notice that now and again Valerian wiped his cheeks with the back of his paw, or blew his nose so loudly it sounded like the honking of a goose heading south. Summer colds are stupid, he kept saying. No one pointed out that he had no cold before Poppy's news. Those children who remembered Ragweed best sniffled, wept in corners, or exchanged reminiscence, trying with little success to keep their grief private, or to keep a brave face. Then they got it in their heads that it was their parents who needed to be consoled the most. Not knowing what to say, they did what they thought was the next best thing. They did whatever they were asked to do, and some things that they were not asked as well. Did them so fast They almost tripped over themselves in their desire to please. So they were constantly cleaning up, sweeping the entry hall, minding the infants, preparing meals, and anything they could think of that might soothe their parents. Someone was always sweeping, straightening up, or burping babies. The result was a continual low hubbub that got on everybody's nerves. If two of the youngest mice got into a scuffle, they didn't quite grasp what had happened. It was their eldest brothers and sisters who stepped in and stifled the discord. "Please," they whispered. Excuse me. "Clover is very sad." "Okay," or "Valerian is crying." This so alarmed the youngsters that they sniffled and whimpered and clung to their parents more than ever. As for Poppy, she hardly knew what to do or say. No one asked her to do anything. No one asked her to leave. On the contrary, they had assured her that she should stay. She was stared at a lot as one who had a particular connection to Ragweed and his awful death, and thus seemed extraordinary. Still, no one inquired about her feelings, her life. She felt as useless as an extra tail. She did find time to take Thimble aside and ask, "Was I wrong? But didn't I see another brother here? He had a notch in his right ear. He was standing way in the back, behind you all. He seems to have rushed away." "You must mean Rye," Thistle replied. "Rye," Poppy repeated, grateful that at least she now had a name for the one with whom she had danced. Where do you think he went?" she asked, sensing that she was blushing a little. Thistle cocked her head to one side and considered Poppy. Then, in a matter-of-fact way, she said, "Rye is always a little weird." "Weird? Why? How?" "He gets sort of dreamy. You know, he goes off a lot by himself." Why do you think he ran off this time?" Poppy wanted to know, though she had a fairly good idea. "He's very emotional," Thistle said. "He loved Ragweed, but he sort of didn't, if you know what I mean." "I don't think I do." "A younger brother," Thistle whispered, as if that explained it all. Then she added, "Ragweed wasn't big enough to admit Rye was better than he was at some things. He was always giving Rye a hard time. And Rye, he was, well, you know, envious that his brother was everybody's favorite." "Do you think Rye will come back?" Thistle shrugged. "Yeah, sure." Poppy tried to make herself useful by tending to the children. She was not very good at it. Besides, they were inclined to stare at her as if she were odd. Being a deer mouse, she was smaller than they, and her fur was a different color. For her own part, Poppy knew perfectly well she was stalling, doing little except waiting for Rye's return. At the same time, the thought of his coming back made her nervous. She wasn't exactly sure what she felt. What would she say to him? Ooh, listen to the wind. The wind's picking up. Poppy's thoughts were interrupted when Clover asked Valerian to bring her close. I need to ask you a little more about ragweed, she said to Poppy. I'll tell you anything I know, Poppy said. Clover and Valerian asked Poppy many questions. How she had met ragweed. Where was this dim wood forest she had come from? Who and what was her family? Did she and ragweed in fact marry? Poppy told them all that had happened, how she had grown up with her own family on a farm at the edge of Dimwood Forest, how she met and had fallen in love with ragweed only to be right there when the owl, a Mr. Okax, had killed him. She told them how she had defeated this Mr. Okax. Finally, she told them of her desire to bring them the news of their son. As she told her tale, she kept looking out of the corner of her eye for Rye. The last thing she wanted was for him to show up and hear what she was saying. We need you to know, Valerian said, when Poppy was done, that even though you didn't marry ragweed, we'd like to think of you as our daughter. We really do, Clover agreed with a catch in her voice. This isn't much of a home, Valerian went on, but it's all we have. You're welcome to stay too. Thank you, Poppy returned. I'm truly touched. She reached up and took off ragweed's earrings. I brought this back for you, she said. It was his. I thought you should have it. She held out the earring. The purple beads seemed to glow. The little chain sparkled. Did he give it to you? Clover asked. In a way, Poppy said. Ah, Clover said softly. He was wearing one when he left home. It must have something to do with the life he had with you. I have no idea where he got it, Poppy told them. He had it on when I met him. Any notion what he did from the time he left here to the time he met you? Valerian asked. Poppy shook her head. He never really said, but he did talk about his home fondly. Clover held the earring in the palm of her paw, as if it were something magical. With a sigh, she offered it to Valerian, who contemplated it too. Then Valerian handed it back to Poppy. I think you should keep it. Poppy looked to Clover. Clover nodded her agreement. After a moment's hesitation, Poppy took the earring and fixed it back on her ear. I'll stay a little while. But Poppy knew she was only staying so she could speak to Rye. What had happened with ragweed, she told herself, was the past. It was done, finished, complete. She would remember the past, but she would not live it. Instead, she would wait for Rye. But Rye did not return. Though no one seemed to be concerned, Poppy began to wonder if he would ever come back. She began to suspect and fear he would not. What do you think? Do you think Rye will come back? Or not? Chapter 13. I'm going to go ahead and read another chapter so we can find out what happened to Rye. As Rye had listened to Poppy speak about ragweed, he hardly knew what to think. He was confused. He was upset. He felt humiliated. Ragweed was always getting his way. He had done so when he was alive. Now he was doing so even after he had died. And yet, Ragweed knew perfectly well that Ragweed's death was awful. Truly, he felt terrible about it. And yet, from the moment he had begun his dance on the meadow with this graceful mouse, this one named Poppy, he had fallen in love with her. He hoped and thought she felt something of the same for him. But now that she had discovered that he was Ragweed's brother and admitted she loved Ragweed, surely there was no hope for him. And yet, he found himself thinking that perhaps, now that Ragweed had died, Poppy might turn to him. And yet, Rye felt deeply ashamed of himself, how self-centered and selfish he was. Such horrible thoughts. How low, how bad. Poppy would never be able to see anything decent in him. But the very next moment he thought, I'm not a bad mouse. I'm not. It was with these thoughts that Rye raced from the nest. He did not go far. He could not outrun his feelings. More importantly, he did not want to go away from this deer mouse, this Poppy. He found himself at the edge of the beaver's pond. It was raining steadily, monotonously. The world looked the way he felt, gray and sodden. Moreover, except for him, everything seemed immense. He was nothing but a small, bad, useless mouse. Hunkering down, consumed by the sensation that the whole world despised him, Rye shivered with wet and cold. Is there any place in this wide world for such a wretch as I? He asked himself. Simultaneously, he darted a look over his shoulder to see if it was just possible. Someone, he dared not to say who, had followed him. When he saw that no one had, he was angry he'd even checked. A mournful Rye gazed down at the pond. A mist was rising off the water as if it were smoldering. A few beavers were hard at work. Suddenly, Rye saw that the pond was much higher than it had been before. Anger swept through him. How he hated the beavers. Yet, there they were, making the dam higher, even as misery rained down on his head. Had they no feelings? Would they never stop? As he looked on, Rye began to have an idea. If he could find some way to put an end to what the beavers were doing, might not he in some way redeem himself? Surely if he kept them from building the dam higher, or better yet, forced them to move away, he would become a hero to his family. He and he alone would defeat them. Why, even Poppy might see him as different from Ragweed then. Rye surveyed the pond. The beaver's main lodge was not far from the dam. He remembered his father telling him that the way the beavers got into the lodge was by swimming through an underwater passage. If he could get into the lodge, he might. Actually, Rye was not at all sure what he might do. He supposed he would think of something once in the lodge. The main thing was to get there. Surely he could do that. Like all his brothers and sisters, he was a good swimmer. Rye raced down to the edge of the pond. The beaver's dam was built where the brook had narrowed out a V in the land. The dam, made of twigs, branches, and logs, plastered over with mud, was some 20 feet across and 3 feet wide. By going out along the dam, he would be that much closer to the lodge. But when Rye reached the end of the dam, a beaver was working on it. He had brought up a heap of mud and dumped it, and was now using his tail to smooth it down. Though impatient, Rye bided his time. One whack of the beaver's tail, not to mention what he could do with his teeth, and Rye would be crushed. The beaver on the dam gave some final pats to the mud, surveying his work, uttering a few grunts, moved ponderously towards the edge of the dam, then dove into the water and swam away. Rye crawled out upon the dam, his way impeded by the twigs and branches, which were crisscrossed and bent in all directions. By the time he got near the lodge, he was caked with mud and bits of leaves. Not caring how he looked, Rye crept down as close to the water as possible. There he hesitated. Then an image of Poppy rose in his mind's eye. If he could succeed, he would be a hero. Holding his nose with one paw, Rye jumped into the water, tail first. He landed with a splat, momentarily floundered, then righted himself. Shaking his eyes and whiskers free of water, he began to swim toward the lodge. 3 feet from the lodge, he paused and began to tread water. He had reached the most difficult part, the entrance. Suddenly he realized he had no notion where, other than underwater, the entry hole might be. It could be on the side he was, or opposite. He would have to try his luck. Filling his lungs with air, he let himself drop down and began to swim underwater. If it had been gray on the water's surface, it was much darker below. Before him, the lodge loomed like a shadowy lump. It sat upon the bottom of the pond and rose up, a huge dome, enormous, impenetrable. Got a tough word here, guys. Impenetrable. It means you can't get into it, okay? Stroking steadily, Rye pushed on, a trail of tiny bubbles escaping from his clenched mouth. Gradually, he began to make out what appeared to be a dark hole. Was that the entryway? Lungs close to bursting, Rye had to make a decision. If he guessed wrong, he would drown. At least I tried, he told himself. Farewell, Poppy, he murmured. Farewell, love. Farewell, world. Kicking hard, paws madly stroking the water, he propelled himself into the hole. The moment he did so, everything turned as dark as night without a moon. Rye was no longer trying to get in to the lodge. He was struggling to save his life. His strokes were wild, his kicks frenzied. Unable to endure any more, he shot up and found air. Gasping for breath, he waved his paws feebly to keep afloat and slowly moved towards a ledge of slippery mud. Reaching it, he clawed his way up, falling back a few times, finally heaving himself up on the slimy shelf. Eyes shut, he lay there, coughing and spitting water. He opened his eyes. He was in the lodge. A few feet away sat an enormous beaver. The beaver was looking right at him. "Well, bless my teeth and soothe my tail," Mr. Kanad said with a full smile of orange teeth. "Glad you came, pal. A stranger is just a friend you haven't met. Hey, and I mean that sincerely." Well, now we don't know what's going to happen. What's Mr. Kanad going to do now that Rye is in the lodge? We don't know, do we? We'll have to wait and see tomorrow. Goodbye.